Cotton made the landowner rich. It kept the sharecropper hungry. Between the last boll picked in the fall and the first seed dropped in the spring, there was a season most history books leave out entirely. No wages, no credit at the commissary, just whatever hung in the smokehouse, whatever grew wild along the ditch bank, and whatever a woman could stretch in a cast iron pot before dark. Number 19 on this list was pulled alive from the creek mud, and the person who grabbed it knew that one wrong move could cost a finger. Number 14 was hunted after dark with a dog and a lantern and kept alive in a pen for a week before it ever reached the table. And number 16 started at the hoof and ended on a plate that people fought over. These were not recipes. These were the terms of survival for people who worked the land they would never own. Hit subscribe because these are the meals history walked past. Here are 25 meals Black sharecroppers lived on between cotton harvests. Number 25, ash cake. Before there was a skillet, there was the fire itself. Cornmeal mixed with water and a pinch of salt was shaped into a flat round and buried directly in the hot ashes of the hearth. After 20 minutes, the cake was pulled out, brushed off, and broken open. The inside was dense, slightly smoky, and warm enough to steam in the cold air. Ash cake required no pan, no oven, no grease, and no skill beyond knowing how deep to bury the dough and how long to leave it. Children made them. Field hands made them at the edge of a clearing during the workday. It was the most basic form of bread a human being could produce with corn, water, and fire. Number 24, cornmeal mush. A handful of cornmeal stirred slowly into a pot of boiling water with a pinch of salt was the most common breakfast in a sharecropper's cabin. The mush thickened as it cooked, turning from cloudy water into a dense, pale porridge that held the shape of the spoon. It was eaten hot from the pot with sorghum poured over the top, or it was poured into a pan and left to set until it firmed into a solid block. The next morning, slices of the cold mush were cut and fried in lard until the outside turned golden and crisp while the inside stayed soft. Fried mush with sorghum was a second breakfast made from the first breakfast's leftovers. The meal required nothing but cornmeal, water, and fire. A woman who kept a sack of cornmeal in the pantry kept hunger at a distance because mush could be stretched to feed any number of people by adding more water to the pot. Number 23, fatback and biscuits. Fatback was exactly what it sounded like. The thick slab of fat cut from the back of a hog, cured in salt, and hung in the smokehouse until it was needed. It was not bacon. There was no meat running through it. It was pure fat, sliced thin and fried in a skillet until the edges went brown and the center turned translucent. The rendered grease stayed in the pan, and that grease made the biscuits. Flour, a little lard, maybe some buttermilk if the cow was still giving, patted out by hand and baked in a wood-fired oven until they split open on their own. A sharecropper's breakfast in January was 2 biscuits, a slice of fried fatback, and whatever was left in the coffee pot from the night before. Nobody called it a meal plan. Nobody needed to. Number 22, sorghum, molasses, and corn pone. Sorghum was the sharecropper's sugar. The cane grew tall in southern fields and was pressed at a local mill every fall, boiled down into a thick amber syrup that lasted through the winter. Corn pone, a denser cousin of cornbread made without eggs or milk, baked hard enough to hold its shape. The two went together every morning in thousands of cabins across Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. A piece of corn pone dragged through a puddle of sorghum on a tin plate. Children ate it before school. Adults ate it before walking to someone else's field. It cost almost nothing to produce because the sharecropper grew both crops. The sorghum ran out by March. The corn pone did not last much longer, but for the months when both were in the house, that tin plate was the steadiest thing on the table. Number 21, hog ear stew. When the hog was butchered in December, the ears were scraped clean, singed over the fire, and dropped into a pot of water with onion, bay leaf, and black pepper. They simmered for hours until the cartilage turned soft and the liquid thickened into a sticky, rich broth. The ears were pulled out, sliced thin, and returned to the pot with whatever root vegetables the cellar still held. Hog ear stew was thick enough to hold a spoon upright. The gelatin from the cartilage gave it a body that no bone broth could match. Nobody bought hog ears. They came free with the rest of the head, and a woman who knew how to cook them turned scrap into something her children asked for by name. Number 20, collard greens with neck bones. Collard greens could survive a frost. That made them one of the most important winter vegetables in a sharecropper's garden. The leaves were stripped from the stalk, rolled tight, sliced into ribbons, washed in cold water, and dropped into a pot with smoked neck bones, a splash of vinegar, and enough water to cover. They cooked for hours. The bones gave up their marrow and their salt. The greens turned soft and dark. By the time the pot came off the stove, the liquid at the bottom was almost black. That liquid was saved. A sharecropper's wife did not pour it down the drain because there was no drain. She saved it because it held everything the greens had to give. A cup of that broth, heated the next morning, was a meal on its own. Number 19, cooter stew. The snapping turtle lived in every pond, creek, and drainage ditch across the cotton belt, and catching one was a test of nerve. A man waded into shallow water, felt along the muddy bottom with his feet, and grabbed the turtle by the tail before it could turn and bite. Snapping turtles had jaws strong enough to take a finger, and every man who caught cooters had a scar or a story about someone who did not move fast enough. The turtle was killed, the shell pried open, and the meat cut away from the bones and the yellow fat that ran through the body cavity. The fat was removed carefully because it carried a strong, muddy flavor that could ruin the pot. The cleaned meat was cut into pieces and browned in lard, then simmered for hours in a heavy pot with onion, wild garlic, a few potatoes, and enough water to cover everything. Cooter meat was dense, darker than chicken, with a texture closer to a pork shoulder after the long cooking broke down the connective tissue. The broth thickened on its own from the gelatin in the bones and cartilage. A single large snapping turtle produced enough meat to fill a pot that fed a family in the family next door. Cooter stew carried weight beyond the meal itself. A man who caught and cleaned a snapping turtle was demonstrating a kind of knowledge that could not be learned from anyone but another man who had done it. The skill was passed down at the edge of the water, not at the table, and it belonged to a world that started disappearing the moment families moved into cities where the nearest creek was buried under concrete. Number 18, creek catfish. Every creek and drainage ditch in the cotton belt held catfish. Catching them did not require a store-bought rod. A sharecropper's child used a length of cotton twine, a hook bent from wire or bought for a penny at the commissary, and a piece of chicken liver or a ball of cornmeal dough for bait. The lines were set at dusk and checked at dawn. Whatever came up was cleaned on the creek bank, rolled in cornmeal with salt and pepper, and fried in lard until the skin crackled and the flesh inside stayed white and flaky. Catfish was one of the few sources of fresh protein that did not come from the hog and did not need to be hunted with a weapon. It swam into the pan on its own schedule, and a good stretch of creek could feed a family through the entire off-season without asking permission from anyone. Number 17, dried butter beans with salt pork. Butter beans were planted along the fence rows and between the cotton rows where they did not compete for the plow. The fresh beans were shelled in summer and spread on a cloth in the sun until they dried hard enough to rattle in a jar. Those jars lined the pantry shelf and lasted through the winter. A handful of dried butter beans, soaked overnight and simmered the next day with a piece of salt pork, produced a pot of thick, starchy broth with beans that held their shape but gave way soft against the tongue. The salt pork melted into the liquid and seasoned it without needing anything else. A bowl of butter beans with cornbread was a complete supper that used nothing from the commissary except the salt in the pork. Number 16, stewed pig feet. The feet was split, scrubbed, and simmered in a pot with vinegar, onion, and bay leaf for most of a day. The collagen in the joints dissolved slowly into the liquid and turned it into a thick, gelatinous broth that set firm when it cooled. The meat around the toes and the ankle was small, tucked into crevices between bone and cartilage, and getting at it required fingertips and teeth. Eating pig feet was slow, deliberate work, and nobody rushed through it. A plate of stewed pig feet with hot sauce and cornbread was a winter supper that took all evening to finish. The feet cost nothing. They came with the hog, and nobody else in the supply chain wanted them. That made them available, and availability was the currency that fed a sharecropper's table. Here is something worth pausing over. Everything served so far came from one of three places: the smokehouse, the garden, or the wild. Not one of them came from a grocery store shelf. Not one of them arrived in a package with a brand name. The sharecropping system was a closed loop designed to extract labor while giving back as little as possible. The commissary sold flour, sugar, coffee, and salt on credit, and the credit was always more expensive than the cash price. A family that bought too much at the commissary started the next season already in debt. The meals on this list exist because families chose to eat from what they could grow, raise, trap, fish, or forage, rather than go deeper into a hole they could never climb out of. These are not poor decisions. These are economic calculations made under pressure by people who understood exactly what the system was doing to them. Number 15, hoe cake. The name came from the tool. Field hands mixed cornmeal with water and salt, shaped the dough into a flat round, and cooked it on the broad blade of a garden hoe held over an open fire. The hoe was already in the field. The fire was already burning at the edge of the clearing. The cornmeal came in a pocket or a folded cloth. A hoe cake took minutes to cook and could be eaten with one hand while the other hand kept working. At home, the same dough was fried in lard in a cast iron skillet, and the result was a crisp golden cake with a tender center that crumbled when it was broken apart. Hoe cake was older than cornbread, simpler than ash cake, and required less fuel than either. It was the bread of the field, not the kitchen, and it belonged to the hours between dawn and dark when there was no table and no time to sit at one. Number 14, raccoon and root vegetables. Raccoon hunting happened after dark. The animal was nocturnal, clever, and harder to catch than a possum. A man went out with a dog trained to tree coons and a kerosene lantern tied to his belt. The dog ran ahead, nose to the ground, following the scent trail through the woods until it found the raccoon and chased it up a tree. The barking changed to pitch when the animal was treed and the hunter followed the sound. Once the raccoon was caught, it was taken home alive and penned for several days, fed on cornmeal and table scraps to clean out whatever it had been eating in the wild. After the penning period, the raccoon was killed, scalded, and scraped of its fur. The carcass was soaked in salt water overnight to draw out the gaminess. Then it was placed in a roasting pan on a bed of sweet potatoes, onions, and carrots, seasoned with salt, pepper, and sage, and roasted low and slow until the meat pulled away from the bone. The fat rendered down during cooking and soaked into the root vegetables underneath. Raccoon suppers were social events. A man who brought home a good-sized coon earned respect because hunting at night after a full day in the fields required endurance that not everyone had. Families gathered at the house with the biggest table, and the roasting pan came out of the oven to a room that had been waiting for hours. The tradition faded within a single generation as families moved north during the Great Migration. The woods were too far from the apartment. The knowledge of how to pen, clean, and roast a wild animal traveled in the memories of the people who left, but most of their children never learned it. Number 13, fried squirrel with gravy. Squirrels were everywhere in the hardwood forests that bordered the cotton fields. A boy with a single-shot rifle or a slingshot could bring home 2 or 3 in an afternoon. The squirrels were skinned, cleaned, and cut into pieces at the joints. The pieces were soaked in salt water, dredged in seasoned flour, and fried in lard until the coating crackled and the meat went tender inside. The pan drippings were used to make a thick milk gravy, stirring flour into the hot fat and adding milk slowly until it thickened. Fried squirrel with gravy over biscuits was a Sunday dinner in households that could not afford a chicken. The meat was darker than chicken, leaner, with a mild gaminess that the gravy smoothed out. 2 squirrels fed a family of 4 if the biscuits were generous and the gravy was thick. A boy who could shoot straight and clean what he caught contributed to the household in a way that did not depend on the landowner's permission or the commissary's credit. Number 12, kush. Leftover cornbread that had gone dry and stale was never thrown away. It was crumbled into a bowl and covered with whatever liquid the kitchen had on hand. In some cabins, that meant the broth left over from a pot of greens. In others, it was buttermilk, sweet milk, or plain water sweetened with sorghum. The cornbread soaked up the liquid and turned into a soft porridge-like mash that was eaten with a spoon. Some families fried the crumbled cornbread in bacon drippings with onion until it formed a loose, savory scramble. Kush was not a recipe anyone wrote down. It was an instinct. Stale bread plus liquid equals another meal, and in a cabin where cornbread appeared at every supper, the next morning's kush was already waiting on the shelf. Number 11, crackling hominy. Hominy was dried corn soaked in lye water until the hulls loosened and the kernels swelled to twice their size. The lye came from wood ash, filtered through water, and the process went back centuries. Once the hulls were rubbed off and the hominy was rinsed clean, it was boiled until tender and served in a bowl with crackling stirred through. The cracklings, those crispy golden bits left over after rendering lard, gave the bland hominy salt, fat, and crunch in every spoonful. Crackling hominy was a winter breakfast that required no flour, no eggs, and no sugar. It was corn and pork fat in their most basic forms, and it sat in the stomach like a stone until noon. A bowl of crackling hominy on a cold morning kept a man upright through 4 hours of splitting firewood. Here is the part that rarely makes it into the books. The land a sharecropper worked belonged to someone else. The tools belonged to someone else. The mule belonged to someone else. At the end of the season, the cotton was weighed and the math was done at the landowner's table, not the sharecroppers. Whatever number the owner wrote in the ledger was the number that stood. Families who worked from March through November could walk away owing more than they started with. The off-season was not a vacation. It was the period when the debt sat still and the family survived on what they had stored, grown, caught, or foraged without anyone's permission. Every meal between these numbers came out of that silence. Number 10, fried okra. Okra grew fast in the southern heat and produced pods from June through September without stopping. The pods were picked young, sliced into rounds no thicker than a coin, and rolled in cornmeal with salt and pepper. They fried in lard in a hot skillet, stirred constantly until the cornmeal coating turned dark gold and the slime that fresh okra released cooked away into a crisp shell around each piece. Fried okra, eaten straight from the skillet, was crunchy, salty, and faintly sweet from the vegetable itself. A woman who kept her okra patch producing through the summer had a side dish that showed up at every meal for 3 months without costing a single trip to the commissary. The excess was sliced, spread on a screen, and dried in the sun for winter use, when the dried rounds went into soups and stews to thicken the broth from the inside out. Number 9, persimmon beer. Wild persimmon trees grew along fence rows and at the edges of the woods, and the fruit was useless until the first frost turned it soft and sweet. Before the frost, a persimmon would pucker the mouth so hard it felt like chewing cotton. After the frost, the same fruit turned orange, almost translucent, and sweet enough to eat raw. Ripe persimmons were mashed in a crock, mixed with cornmeal and water, and left to ferment in a warm corner of the cabin for several days. The result was a mildly alcoholic drink, cloudy and sweet, with a fizz that rose from the bottom of the cup. Persimmon beer was the only drink, besides water, that a Sharecroppers family made for themselves from something wild, and the fact that it arrived only once a year after the first hard freeze made it taste like the season had finally offered something back. Number 8, fried pies, dried peaches, or dried apples soaked overnight and cooked down with sorghum and a pinch of cinnamon made the filling. Biscuit dough rolled thin and cut into rounds the size of a saucer held the fruit. A spoonful of filling went on one half of the round, the other half folded over, and the edges were crimped shut with a fork. The pies went into a skillet of hot lard and fried until the crust blistered golden brown on both sides. The filling inside turned soft and almost jam-like, and the crust sealed it in so nothing leaked into the grease. Fried pies were portable. A field hand carried 2 in a coat pocket and ate them cold at noon, standing in the row. Children ate them warm from the skillet, with the filling still hot enough to burn the roof of the mouth. A woman who put up enough dried fruit in the fall could make fried pies all winter, and a fried pie in January held the memory of a peach tree in August. Number 7, clabber and cornbread. Clabber was milk left to sit at room temperature until it thickened and soured on its own. It was not buttermilk and it was not cheese. It was something between the two, thick enough to hold a spoon upright, tangy and cool. Families that kept a cow set a jar of fresh milk on the back of the stove or on a shelf near the chimney, and within a day or two the clabber was ready. It was eaten plain from a cup, poured over crumbled cornbread in a bowl, or sweetened with sorghum for the children. Clabber required no churning, no cooking, and no ice. The bacteria did the work. A jar of clabber on the shelf meant the milk would not be wasted, and nothing in a sharecropper's kitchen was allowed to go to waste. Number 6, chow chow. At the end of the growing season, whatever the garden still held, green tomatoes that would never ripen, the last of the cabbage, a few onions, the peppers that had turned but were still firm, was chopped fine, salted, drained overnight, and cooked in vinegar with mustard seed, celery seed, and a little sugar. The mixture was packed into jars and sealed. Chow chow was a relish, not a meal on its own, but it turned plain food into something worth sitting down for. A spoonful on top of a bowl of dried beans changed the whole plate. A smear on a piece of cornbread gave it an acid bite that cut through the heaviness of a winter diet built almost entirely on pork fat and corn. Every jar of chow chow represented a decision to salvage what was left instead of letting the frost take it. The garden was finished. The jars were not. Number 5, pea hull soup. After dried peas were shelled on the porch, the hulls were swept into a pile and boiled in a pot with a ham bone and whatever onion the garden still held. The hulls gave up a starchy, earthy broth that thickened as it cooked down. Bits of ham clinging to the bone fell apart into the liquid. Pea hull soup existed because a sharecropper's wife looked at the pile of scraps left after the real food was put away and decided that pile still had something to give. She was right. Number 4, cane skimmings. When sorghum cane was pressed and the juice was boiled down into syrup at the local mill, a thick green foam rose to the surface and was skimmed off with a long-handled ladle. That foam, called skimmings, was the waste product of the process. The mill operator let people take it home for free. The skimmings were boiled down further at home into a rough, dark sweetener that was grainier and less refined than the finished sorghum, but still sweet enough to pour over cornbread or stir into a morning cup of hot water. Children drank skimmings diluted in water as a sweet drink when there was nothing else. The taste was raw and vegetal, with a bitterness the finished syrup had lost. It was sugar for people who could not afford sugar, and it came from standing at the mill long enough to collect what everyone else threw away. Number 3, egg custard. If the hens were still laying, a woman could make a custard with eggs, a cup of sweet milk, a little sorghum, and a scraping of vanilla bark if it was in the house. The mixture was poured into a dish, set inside a pan of water, and baked slowly in the oven until it firmed and the top turned golden brown. Egg custard was the simplest dessert a kitchen could produce, and it appeared on tables where cake was impossible because flour and sugar were rationed for bread. The custard was smooth, cool by the time it was served, and sweet enough to feel like a reward after a week of salt pork and greens. A child who was handed a dish of egg custard understood without being told that the eggs could have been sold or traded at the commissary. The custard was a choice. Somebody decided the family deserved something gentle. Number 2, stewed dried apples. Apples picked in the fall were peeled, cored, sliced thin, and dried on a rack in the sun or near the fire until they turned leathery and brown. They kept for months in a cloth sack hung from a nail. In the dead of winter, a handful of dried apples, rehydrated in a pot of water with sorghum and cinnamon, made a stew that smelled like October in the middle of February. Some families dropped strips of dough into the simmering fruit and made dumplings. Others ate the stewed apples plain, warm from the pot with a piece of cornbread on the side. A woman who had put up enough dried apples in October knew her family would not go without something sweet when the ground was frozen. The dried apples remembered the orchard. The kitchen remembered the sun. Number 1, the smokehouse. This was not a meal. This was the room that made every meal on this list possible. A small wooden building, usually no bigger than an outhouse, standing a few yards from the cabin. Inside, hams, shoulders, fatback, jowls, and side meat hung from hooks driven into the rafters, curing in salt and smoke from a slow fire of hickory or oak that burned on the floor below. The smokehouse was filled once a year in December after the hog was killed. Everything that hung inside it had to last until the next killing. A woman who managed the smokehouse well, cutting small, rationing carefully, rotating what was used, could stretch a single hog from December to September. A woman who could not left her family eating plain cornbread by April. The smokehouse was locked, not against strangers, but against the temptation to take too much too soon. Every meal between cotton harvests started with the walk to that door and a calculation of what could be spared without shortening the months ahead. Number 20, cow tongue. A whole beef tongue was boiled for several hours until the thick outer skin could be peeled away in one piece. What remained was tender, fine-grained meat that sliced thin and clean. Families served it cold with mustard or hot with gravy over rice. The tongue was large, enough to feed a full table, and it cost a fraction of what a roast or a steak would run. The texture put some people off. It looked exactly like what it was. But for families who grew up eating it, tongue was a luxury that happened to be priced like scraps. When younger cooks stopped buying unfamiliar cuts, cow tongue quietly disappeared from black dinner tables. Every item on this list so far came from the same place. Not a restaurant, not a cookbook. The hoe cake was baked in fireplace ashes. The rabbit brains were fried the morning after the hunt. The blackberry acid steeped in a pantry crock. In the 1960s, a black family's kitchen was connected to the land in a way that no modern food system replicates. The garden was not a hobby. The tree line, the hog pen, the creek bottom where the berries grew wild, these were the aisles of a grocery store that charged nothing and required everything. What it required was knowledge. Which roots made tea, which greens were safe to pick, which cuts needed soaking. That knowledge lived in the hands of the people who worked the land. When those families moved to cities, they carried the recipes but lost the source. Fried fatback was thick slabs of pure pork fat cooked until crispy on edges and rendered in the middle, served alongside whatever else the table held. Sharecropper families bought fatback by the pound from country stores, often on credit, adding to mounting debts because it provided cheap calories and flavoring for nearly everything they cooked. Slices were laid in cold cast iron skillets and cooked slowly as fat melted and meat crisped, producing both a protein course and cooking grease for vegetables or cornbread. Children loved crispy edges best, fighting over pieces where fat transformed into something almost candy-like in crunch and salt. Rendered fat was saved in coffee cans, used to season greens, fry eggs, make biscuits, and coat cornbread pans. Nothing was wasted. Even crispy remnants left after rendering were crumbled over food or eaten as snacks. Fatback provided dense calories that bodies working 14-hour days desperately required. Number 18, possum stewed with sweet potatoes. Possum hunting was a winter tradition across the Delta for decades. From November through February, men would walk the woods after the first frost with a coon dog and a kerosene lantern. The meat was greasy and gamey and needed a long simmer with sweet potatoes to soften the flavor. A sharecropper's wife would parboil the possum twice to render the fat, then bake it slow with sweet potato chunks until the meat fell from the bone. The dish was not pretty, it was not refined, it was wild meat stretched with garden starch, feeding a cabin that had no chicken left in the yard. Possum and sweet potatoes appeared in Christmas suppers across Sunflower County right through the 1930s, all the way to the start of World War II. Your kin hunted it. The cabin cooked it. Your great aunts remembered the taste for 60 years. It was the meal that said, the woods will provide what the landowner will not. Number 26, fried cornmeal mush. Cornmeal was stirred into boiling salted water and cooked until it thickened into a dense porridge. The hot mush was poured into a loaf pan and left in the icebox overnight until it set solid enough to slice. The next morning, the slices were fried in bacon drippings until both sides turned golden and crisp while the center stayed soft and warm. Fried mush was eaten at breakfast with syrup poured over the top or alongside fried eggs and salt pork. It cost almost nothing to make and filled the stomach for hours. The women who cooked it made the porridge thick enough to hold its shape when sliced and thin enough not to crack in the skillet. When boxed cereal and instant oatmeal took over the morning table, nobody stood at the stove stirring cornmeal anymore. Number 25, clabber. Raw whole milk was left in a covered crock at room temperature until the natural bacteria turned it thick and sour, somewhere between yogurt and soft cheese. Clabber was eaten from a bowl with a spoon, sometimes sprinkled with sugar or nutmeg, sometimes with cornbread crumbled into it. The taste was tangy and rich, nothing like the flat sourness of store-bought buttermilk. Families who kept a cow had clabber on the table almost every day. It required no cooking and no preparation beyond patience and clean milk. When pasteurization became standard and raw milk disappeared from the kitchen, the crock stopped working the way it always had. Pasteurized milk does not clabber, it just spoils. Clabber milk was raw milk left to sour naturally until it thickened into a tangy, yogurt-like substance that sharecropper families ate with cornbread or drank straight. Without refrigeration, fresh milk from the family cow wouldn't last long in southern heat, so families embraced the souring process rather than fighting it. Milk was left in crocks on cool porches until it separated into thick curds and thin whey, developing sharp flavor that modern palates might find challenging but hungry families welcomed. Some ate clabber sweetened with molasses, while others crumbled cornbread into bowls of it for breakfast or supper. The process required no special equipment, just patience and understanding that controlled spoilage differed from dangerous rot. Children often preferred it to fresh milk, having grown up with its distinctive tang as normal. Clabber provided protein and kept digestive systems healthy when medical care remained out of reach. Number 19, fried catfish from the Muddy Bayou. A retired sharecropper from Tallahatchie County, an old-timer named Robert Anderson, told a WPA interviewer in 1938 that the river fed his family every Friday for 11 straight years. He set trot lines in the bayou before he walked to the field at sunrise. By dusk, when he came back through the trees, 3 or 4 catfish were waiting on the line. His wife rolled them in cornmeal seasoned with salt and a pinch of black pepper. The cast iron skillet, slick with bacon grease, accepted them whole. The catfish hissed and turned dark gold in 8 minutes. The skin crisped, the flesh inside flaked sweet and clean. Friday night supper was a plate of fish, a wedge of cornbread, and a glass of well water. The river belonged to everyone and no one. The trot line cost almost nothing. And for a family that lived on credit, a free supper was a quiet kind of dignity that the furnished ledger could never touch. You ate slow, you picked the bones clean, you went to bed full. Number 30, ash hoe cake. Before there was an oven in the house, there was a fireplace and a flat piece of iron. Cornmeal was mixed with water and a pinch of salt, shaped flat by hand, and laid on a hoe blade or a hearthstone propped against the coals. The bottom charred where it touched the iron. The top stayed pale and steaming. The flavor was raw corn and wood smoke, gritty from the ash that clung to the crust. Ash hoe cake was field food, carried in a cloth to the row where a man worked until dark. By the 1960s, the fireplace had already given way to the gas stove, and the last generation that baked bread in the coals was watching their grandchildren heat the oven with a dial. Number 29, fried fatback. A slab of fatback was the cheapest cut at the butcher counter. Solid pork fat with a thin ribbon of meat along one edge, sliced thick, fried in its own grease until the outside cracked and curled. Families who could not afford ham or bacon put fried fat back on the plate where the meat was supposed to go. It sat next to the greens. It sat next to the beans. It was the protein. The rendered fat went into a jar on the back of the stove and seasoned every meal that followed. Children ate the crispy edges first, breaking them off with their fingers before the rest of the slab cooled. When doctors started warning about saturated fat in the 1970s, fatback was the first thing to leave the plate. The jar stayed on the stove a while longer, but eventually that went too. Chitterlings were pig intestines, cleaned meticulously and simmered for hours until tender, representing both the brutality and brilliance of making something from nothing. During hog killing season, sharecropper families received parts white landowners that didn't want: feet, ears, tails, and intestines requiring hours of washing to prepare. Women scraped and rinsed chitterlings multiple times, sometimes spending entire days cleaning them until ready for the pot. They simmered with onions, garlic, bay leaves, and vinegar until tough tissue became soft enough to chew, filling cabins with an aroma announcing dinner to neighbors a quarter mile away. The taste was intense and earthy, not for timid palates, but for families who learned to embrace every edible part of the animal. Chitterlings became tradition, served at holidays as reminder of both hardship and triumph. Children understood this food carried stories of ancestors who refused to let white supremacy starve them. Number 20, hoe cake. The name came from the field. A sharecropper working a cotton row would bring a small ball of cornmeal dough wrapped in a piece of cloth. At noon, when the sun made the rows shimmer, you would build a small fire at the edge of the field, scrape the blade of your hoe clean against your pants, and bake the cake right there on the iron. The hoe cake was thin, crisp on the edges, soft in the middle, and tasted of wood smoke and metal. It was the lunch a man ate alone in the cotton, 10 miles from the cabin, with no time to walk back. Across Bolivar County and Coahoma County during the Depression, men who chopped cotton from before sunrise to after sundown lived on hoe cakes and well water for weeks at a time during the 1934 harvest. The blade fed the man who pushed it. That was enough. Number 24, smothered cabbage with ham hocks. A head of cabbage was quartered and laid in a heavy pot on top of smoked ham hocks that had already been simmering for an hour. The pot was covered tight and left on low heat until the cabbage wilted into the pork broth and turned soft and translucent, soaked through with smoke and salt. The ham hocks gave up their meat in shreds, and the cabbage absorbed everything the bone released. A head of cabbage fed a full table for almost nothing, and the broth left at the bottom was sopped up with cornbread or drunk from the bowl. When pre-shredded coleslaw mix replaced the whole head and smoked ham hocks disappeared from the meat case, the smothered pot lost both its ingredients at the same time. Number 23, skillet corn. Fresh ears were shucked and held over a bowl while a knife stripped the kernels from the cob. Then the flat of the blade scraped the bare cob to release the milk trapped inside the rows. Kernels and milk went into a hot skillet with butter or bacon drippings and cooked slowly, stirred and pressed until the corn thickened into something between a side dish and a pudding. The flavor was sweet and full in a way no canned corn could approach. Skillet corn required corn picked that morning from the garden row. When the garden was gone, the corn came from a can, and the milk that made the dish was never inside it. Ash cakes were cornmeal patties cooked directly in hot ashes of dying fires, a method passed down from enslaved ancestors. Sharecropper women mixed coarse stone ground cornmeal with water and salt, forming thick rounds wrapped in dampened cabbage leaves before being buried in warm ashes. The leaves protected cakes while allowing heat to penetrate slowly, creating crusty exteriors with dense, smoky interiors that satisfied hunger for hours. These weren't fancy breads. They were survival food made when firewood was scarce and time for proper cooking even scarcer. Field workers carried ash cakes in pockets, eating them cold during brief rest periods when walking back to the cabin wasn't possible. The taste was earthy, the texture gritty but filling, requiring nothing but meal, water, and fire already burning. Children learned this ancient technique young. Understanding it might mean the difference between hunger and sustenance. Number 17, smothered squirrel with brown gravy. Boys as young as 9 carried single-shot rifles into the river bottom on Saturday mornings to bring home meat. A pair of squirrels was a good day. Their mother would skin them, joint them, dredge the pieces in flour, and brown them in bacon grease. Then she added water, more flour, and a little salt and let the gravy thicken slow over a low fire. The squirrel meat turned tender. The gravy went the color of dark earth. She poured the whole pot over rice or cornbread or whatever. Starch was on the shelf. Smothered squirrel was the dinner that turned a boy's marksmanship into a family's protein. Across Bolivar County in 1936, hunting for the pot was not a hobby. It was the difference between a child going to bed full and a child waking up hungry. The forests of the Mississippi Delta had been hunted clean for 2 centuries by the time the Great Depression came. By the 1930s, a single squirrel was a small miracle. A woman named Lula in Mound Bayou kept the pelts and tanned them for winter mittens. Nothing was thrown out. Not the bones, not the fur, not the broth. Imagine your own kitchen tonight, throwing nothing away for 30 years straight. That was the genius of sharecropping cooking. A 2-pound animal fed a family of 7 and clothed 2 children's hands for a whole winter. The rifle moved from father to son. The cook saved the bones for soup the next day. This was not cuisine, this was engineering. Number 28, watermelon rind pickles. After the red flesh was eaten, the rind was peeled, cubed, and soaked in salted water overnight. The next morning it was boiled until tender, then simmered in a syrup of vinegar, sugar, cinnamon, cloves, and allspice until the pieces turned translucent and the kitchen smelled like a spice cabinet left open in the heat. Watermelon rind pickles were sweet, tangy, and firm enough to hold their shape on a fork. They were canned in glass jars and lined up on the pantry shelf alongside green tomato relish and pickled beets. A family that ate watermelon all summer could put up enough rind pickles to last until the following June. The work was slow and the jars were heavy, but throwing away the rind felt like throwing away food. When watermelon became something bought pre-cut in plastic containers at the grocery store, the rind never made it home. Number 27, opossum and sweet potatoes. The animal was caught, cleaned, and soaked in salted water to pull out the gamey taste. It was parboiled, then laid in a roasting pan surrounded by quartered sweet potatoes and baked low and slow until the meat fell from the bone and the sweet potatoes collapsed into the drippings. The fat from the opossum basted everything in the pan without a single spoonful of added grease. Opossum was served at holiday tables and special suppers in rural communities across the Deep South. The men who trapped them knew the difference between a corn-fed opossum and one that had been eating garbage, and they only brought home the right kind. When families moved into cities and the younger generation saw the animal as a pest rather than a meal, the roasting pan stayed in the cabinet. Poke salad was wild greens foraged from roadsides and fence rows by sharecropper families who knew exactly when and how to harvest this potentially dangerous plant. Pokeweed shoots were gathered young in early spring before leaves grew large and toxic, then boiled in multiple changes of water to remove bitter compounds. The process required knowledge passed through generations, which plants to pick, when to pick them, how many boilings were necessary. After draining final water, greens were fried in pork fat with onions and sometimes scrambled eggs, creating a dish tasting of spring itself. For families with no money for store-bought vegetables and limited garden space, poke salad represented free nutrition growing wild along every path. Children accompanied mothers on gathering trips, learning to identify ripe plants and understand dangers of picking too late. This tradition connected sharecroppers to land in ways transcending economic bondage. Number 21, sweet potato pone. Sweet potatoes were a traditional sharecropper crop because they yielded heavy on poor soil and stored well in a dirt cellar through the winter. A woman would grate raw sweet potato into a bowl, stir in cornmeal, a spoon of sorghum, and a little buttermilk if she had any. The mixture went into a hot cast iron skillet and baked beside the fire until the top crusted dark brown. The inside stayed soft and almost custard-like. Sweet potato pone was Sunday after church food in a kitchen that did not have sugar, butter, or eggs. It tasted like dessert because the sweet potato did the work no other ingredient could afford to do. A woman served it to her kin on a chipped plate with a glass of cold buttermilk, and that single slice could keep you full all afternoon. Children waited all week for it. It was a hug in a bowl when the bowl had almost nothing in it. Number 22, chitlin dumplings. Chitterlings were cleaned, a process that took hours, and filled the house with the smell that announced itself through closed doors. Once boiled until tender, the chitlins were chopped into small pieces and folded into a simple dumpling dough made from flour, water, and a little lard. The dumplings were dropped by spoonfuls into the simmering broth left from the chitterling boil. They puffed and turned soft in the rich, heavy liquid, and each one carried a piece of chitlin inside. The dish stretched a modest amount of chitterlings into a full meal that went further than the chitlins alone. When fewer people were willing to spend a morning cleaning intestines, the dumpling disappeared along with the patience it required. Number 21, stewed squirrel. Squirrel was hunted the same way it had been for generations. A man sat against a tree at dawn with a rifle and waited. The squirrels were skinned, cleaned, and jointed, then browned in a skillet and transferred to a pot with onions, potatoes, and water. The stew simmered until the small bones released their meat. The flavor was darker than chicken, lighter than venison, with a sweetness from the fat just under the skin. Squirrel stew fed families through fall without costing a cent beyond a bullet. Boys learned to hunt squirrels before they learned to drive. When subdivisions replaced the woods, the hunting stopped. The stew became something most people only heard about from the generation before them. Crackling bread transformed rendered pork skin scraps into golden cornbread studded with crispy, salty morsels of flavor. When sharecropper families butchered hogs during winter months, nothing went to waste. Skin was cut into pieces and fried slowly until fat rendered out and remaining bits turned impossibly crispy. These cracklings were folded into cornmeal batter along with rendered lard and buttermilk, then baked in preheated cast iron skillets until tops turned golden brown. The bread emerged with pockets of crunchy pork throughout, each bite delivering salt, fat, and corn in perfect proportion. This wasn't everyday bread. It was celebration food made when precious cracklings were available and families gathered to share what they had preserved. The smell filled small cabins with warmth and promise, reminding everyone that even in poverty, moments of richness were possible. Children fought for corner pieces where cracklings clustered thickest. 25 meals pulled from the smokehouse, the garden, the woods, the creek bank, and the ashes of a fire that never went cold. Not one of them came with instructions. Not one of them required a receipt. Fry a catfish rolled in cornmeal the way it was done when the creek was the only market. Stir a pot of collard greens until the broth turns black. Bake a hoe cake in a skillet and eat it with your hands. Drop in the comments the one your family still makes, the one that crossed state lines and survived the move north. These meals were carried by people who had nothing but what they could grow, catch, and remember. The carrying is what survived.